Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to continue my kind of little mini-series I mentioned in my last review video that I am finishing up preaching through the Gospel of Matthew. So I'm going to be doing some reviews here of resources that I've been using in my series in the Gospel of Matthew. And today I want to share my thoughts on one of those resources. It's a little book called The Parables, Understanding the Stories Jesus Told by Simon Kistemaker. This is put out by Baker. It was published originally in 1980, so it's been out for a number of decades now. This edition was republished in 2002, and it's a very helpful resource that I'm excited to talk about with you today. So first, for those who may not be familiar with Simon Kistemaker, he passed away in 2017, a few years ago, but was a noted New Testament scholar. Born originally in the Netherlands, his family immigrated to Ontario right after World War II. Then he did his studies at Calvin Seminary, just down the street from where I went to seminary. I went to Puritan Reformed Seminary, but we lived right on the same street that Calvin was on, or Calvin is on, I should say. And he did his studies there before going on to the Free University of Amsterdam to do further work in New Testament studies. And he came back to the States and pastored churches in different places, but the bulk of his ministry was spent from about the mid-70s until the mid-90s teaching at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, and then later he and his wife retired to Florida, where the RTS Orlando campus was. Kistemaker is a very well-respected scholar. He was the president of the Evangelical Theological Society, wrote a number of commentaries, several of which were award-winning and very well-respected as an evangelical scholar with unimpeachable academic credentials. And that skill set is very much on display in this book. As the title suggests, it's a commentary on the parables that Jesus told, specifically the parables that are recorded for us in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so this was a book that I found extremely useful as I was working through the Gospel of Matthew, specifically the section beginning in chapter 13 of Matthew's Gospel where Jesus is sharing his kingdom parables. This is a section that, obviously, if you're preaching through the Gospel of Matthew as a whole, as I was doing, you have to work through those parables. But a lot of preachers will actually dip into Matthew's Gospel to do shorter series. Sometimes they'll do just the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7. Sometimes they'll do the kingdom parables that we find in Matthew 13 and so forth. And so whether you are preaching through the gospel as a whole or you're just doing a sort of shorter series, Kistemaker's book is a really useful guide for you. So what he does in this book is really very simple. He has a very helpful introduction where he walks through what a parable is, how to understand it, how to interpret it. He kind of gives you a real quick survey on the history of interpretation. And that's a really important starting place because there's a lot of misconceptions that people have about what a parable is and therefore how to interpret it. I think a lot of people today assume that a parable is nothing more than an illustration. And people will often apply to parables to sort of say, hey, this is a sort of proof text for telling fun stories or jokes or things like that. You know, Jesus was a great storyteller. He knew how to use a great illustration to drive his point home and make his meaning clear. Well, the problem with that kind of way of reading the parables is that Jesus, and we find this in the Gospel of Matthew especially, in addition to telling parables, will also tell us why he's telling parables. And the reason that he gives is not the reason that people will often share. In other words, Jesus, when he's telling parables, says, I'm telling my teaching in parables in order to obscure my meaning to those who are outside the kingdom, but to make clear my meaning to those who are inside the kingdom. So it's a much more complex process. And Kistemaker has a great discussion of what exactly Jesus is doing. Because Jesus is drawing on a tradition of using parables that goes back to the Old Testament, especially the prophets, and he's giving his teaching in parables in part as an indictment to the hard-heartedness of the church in that day, the Israelite community. So there's a lot more we have to unpack in terms of what Jesus is doing in terms of his use of parables, and Kistemaker walks through that in a very helpful way. Another misconception that people have, and this kind of goes back more to church history, a lot of the church fathers, as they dealt with the parables, viewed them more as allegories than anything else. In other words, they wanted to take every piece of every parable and try to assign a meaning to it And therefore, every parable became kind of multi-directional. It was pointing in all sorts of directions, dealing with all sorts of things. You can look at how Augustine, for example, I have a lot of respect for Augustine, but when you look at how he deals with parables, this is what you get. That every piece of the parable symbolizes a different thing. And Kistemaker, standing in the tradition of more reformed exegetes, says this is a mistake. The parables really need to be understood as stories that Jesus is telling, typically to drive home a single point. Now, again, he stresses you don't push that too far. Sometimes there's complexity there. There's a lot going on from a literary perspective. But usually it's something closer to like what an Aesop's fable is doing, where, this story is told in order to communicate a certain message. Now, it's not moralistic in the way that Aesop fables would be, but you wouldn't want to take an Aesop's fable and kind of try to parse out every aspect of what he's saying and give it a meaning. It's driving at a certain point. That's very helpful and important when you're looking at actually teaching or preaching the parables, because it helps you to see that what you're trying to do is to get at the message. And you're not trying to kind of be super creative and find ways of tying every detail of every parable to all sorts of other truths or doctrines or things. You're trying to get at the basic meaning or message that Jesus was communicating, and then as a preacher or teacher, that's the message you're trying to communicate and drive home. And so Kistemaker walks through all of that in the introduction to the book. The bulk of the book is just going through all of the parables that you find in the Synoptic Gospels. And so he has, let's see here, 39 different chapters where he goes through the parables. And some of these parables are only found in one gospel. So, for example, the parable of the wedding banquet is only found in Matthew 22, for example. But others will be found in multiple of the Synoptic Gospels. So, the fig tree, for example, is found in Matthew 24, Mark chapter 13, Luke chapter 21. And so what Kistemaker will do is he will look at each parable in turn. He'll give you the text of it as it appears in whatever gospel it shows up in, and then he'll kind of walk through. What does it mean? How do we interpret it? He'll kind of exposit it, give you different cultural details or applications, because what Jesus is doing in these parables is not telling kind of fantastic tales. He's telling very ordinary, everyday, rooted in real life kind of stories from agriculture and society and wedding banquets and things like that. So you need to have a knowledge of the first century world, and Kistemaker, with his expertise, is able to bring that to you. And then he'll take time with each parable to talk about how it applies. So how do you apply that parable? So this was, as I was working through the parable section of the Gospel of Matthew, the single most helpful book that I used. There were lots of commentaries I referenced. They all had helpful things, but this was very much purpose-built to walk you through the parables, to help you understand the first century context, to help you understand the basic message and meaning that Jesus is communicating, and to help you think through as a preacher or teacher, what are some ways that this parable might apply to the people in front of you. So if you are looking at teaching or preaching through the parables, or you're just working through them in your family worship or your personal devotions or study, this would be the number one resource I would recommend that you get a hold of, because it's a very solid evangelical, reformed discussion of those things. He does a great job. He has a good introduction and a good conclusion, which kind of tie together, again, how do you approach parables? How do you think through these things? And then you can use it as a great reference. Just to look up if you have questions about parables, or you could work through them sequentially, take 2 months or something and go through one set of parables at a time and get exposed to Jesus' teaching in that way. So very, very helpful book, very accessible but very learned. He does have extensive endnotes in the back. Again, I've expressed my thoughts on endnotes in the past. I wish they were footnotes because I like having that there, but maybe having endnotes makes this a little more accessible for those who don't want all of the details, but it's there if you want it. So whether you are looking at preaching or teaching, or just trying to understand this part of Jesus' teaching better yourself, I would highly recommend The Parables by Simon Kistemaker.